So welcome everyone, and thanks for taking your lunch hour if you're on the East Coast. And I know there's some other folks who've registered from other time zones, so whatever time it is where you are, to join me for this webinar on kind of an introduction to selling business to a worker co-op. So this is generally a topic that has been, our organization has been engaged in, along with a lot of others. There's a lot of collaborative work around the United States on this question. So I have a short presentation. A few folks have submitted questions in advance, but feel free to submit questions through the Q&A portion of the Zoom webinar interface. And my presentation slides will be fairly brief, and then we'll have a chance to kind of get into some of the pre-submitted questions and some of those that come up for you as you're watching the presentation. So I will start screen sharing now. All right. So the agenda for today's session, we're going to kind of hit on 5 major areas. First, I'll just talk a little bit about our organization, what we do, and the kinds of both activities and support that we provide. We'll define broad-based employee ownership, which provides the rubric under which we work and under which we see the worker co-op as a key important structure. We'll go through an overview of the worker co-op model, what it is, how it works, and how it's kind of different from other forms of providing broad-based ownership to the employees of a company. And go a little bit into the question of, okay, so if you're interested in selling or buying a business as a worker cooperative, what does that look like? What are both the, what's the general path? What are some of the unique challenges and unique advantages that can be had by going that path? And then I'll open it up and we can see what folks have gotten from the presentation and what questions have emerged. So off to the races. All right, so Vermont Employee Ownership Center, where I'm co-executive director. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. We're modeled after the Ohio Employee Ownership Center, which has been around since the 80s, and there's a number of similar centers around the United States. And the number's been growing thanks to the work of the Employee Ownership Expansion Network recently. We are primarily funded through the economic development infrastructure in the state, as well as through kind of sponsors of an annual conference that we do that brings together folks who both do work for existing employee-owned companies for professional development, along with folks who are exploring employee ownership, which is a great opportunity because it allows those two groups to kind of encounter each other, and the folks who are thinking about it, it goes from being something, oh, that's an interesting idea in the abstract, to, okay, here's people who are doing this day to day, making it work and being successful at it. We have 2 full-time equivalent, 3 staff. We're a small, mostly remote organization. And so our mission is to promote and foster employee ownership in order to broaden capital ownership, deepen employee participation, retain jobs, increase living standards for working families, and stabilize communities. So really, we see employee ownership as a key, not just good business practice, gets everyone rowing in the same direction, but also something that has broader positive impacts on society. So when we think of, there's a lot of talk about ownership and equity in the business community, business world, whether you're talking about startups and stock options, and there's a vast universe of ways that ownership can be structured and cut and all of that. We narrow it in on what we define as broad-based employee ownership. And so that for us is ownership of a business, directly or indirectly, in part or in whole, by a broad cross-section of employees, including non-managerial employees. And also the expectation that all full-time hires will have the opportunity to become co-owners. That doesn't mean you're an owner out the gate when you join the company, but that there's a path to ownership. So we're not talking about something where it's, okay, just a few key employees get some ownership, or managers, or things like that, but something that's a systematic way that all employees who work for a firm have a path to sort of having a stake in its future. And the 2 common forms we work with, and again, there's a lot of opportunity and creativity for designing ownership in a vast universe of options. But the 2 common forms we work with are the employee stock ownership plan and the worker co-op. I'll just mention briefly, sort of employee stock ownership plans are a form of ownership that's essentially a retirement trust owns a company. There's some tax advantages in the U.S. to doing this. It's a much more sort of there's a lot more folks who work for ESOP companies than who work for worker co-ops, partially because of that. But there's also like floor on how big a company can be because there's a lot of compliance requirements. So in this presentation, we'll be talking about worker co-ops, which are much lower overhead in terms of that and can work for very small companies, but not only very small companies. So when we think about, okay, so those broader social benefits of why we want to have more folks owning their work, there's a variety of angles to it. We see, there's benefits to communities in terms of preserving local ownership and jobs and decreasing inequality because everyone kind of has the ability to build equity through their labor. And companies that are owned by the people who work there, in terms of from an economic development perspective, are going to be less likely to make quick decisions about moving different places for tax incentives and things like that when folks are actually rooted in the communities where they work. For employees, there's greater economic security and certainly opportunities for more engagement in work. There's a lot of research out of Rutgers University, which is the Center for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing, really on both of those topics, and it's a great resource to check out if that's of interest. And similarly, that research has shown, as you might intuit, increased productivity, decreases in absentee and turnover, and then there's certain tax benefits to employee ownership that we'll talk about later on in the presentation. But that idea that there's line of sight for employees between what they do, their creativity, their effort, the performance of the company, and then their own financial reward beyond simply their wages, can be a powerful sort of tool and dynamic to really drive performance. And then there's benefits to the selling owner who might be part of a silver tsunami of baby boomers looking to retire and sell their businesses. And this kind of question, we here in Vermont, we're one of the oldest states demographically in the country, so this has been this question of the aging population and possible preventable job loss from people seeking to retire without a succession plan and simply shutting down their business or liquidating it, whereas it otherwise might have been a perfectly good concern if they could find someone to keep it going, is a big part of the broader discourse. And so this is, I think, the COVID era has accelerated a lot of this, and questions of business owners who are near the end of their career, and they're looking at the question of, okay, essentially, do I have to restart my business? Am I start up again at the age of 60? Do I want to go into debt? Do I want to be putting in the 75 hours a week necessary to make that happen? Or are there opportunities to sort of bring the next generation into ownership? And that's something we've been exploring with several business owners and really thinking through a lot about what does that look like in this new moment. So in terms of what owners who are exiting their goals look like, there's many of them, right? Different people are going to prioritize different things, and this is not an exhaustive list, but this, I think covers some of the key bases, right? So one is, especially as if you have a business owner for whom basically all of their financial eggs are in maybe one or two baskets, maybe it's their house and their business, the need to diversify where their wealth is as their kind of desire to be exposed to risk decreases as they get older and are thinking about retirement security. So minimizing after-tax proceeds. Now, this is an interesting kind of thing that that there's tax laws around for both ESOPs and worker co-op, which is basically that if you sell, business, either C corp, corporation ESOP, or C corp to a worker cooperative, the capital gains taxes, if the proceeds are reinvested, those capital gains taxes can be deferred until that kind of replacement property is liquidated. So it's the 1042 rollover is it's called. And for larger transactions where it can be part of estate planning even, that can be a pretty powerful incentive where maybe even a lower sort of top line price could still mean that ultimately the business owner is keeping more total value. Again, that reducing risk exposure. So a lot of small business owners have, if your assets are your house and your business, well, oftentimes that house is part of a personal guarantee of a line of credit or other things around the business. And again, especially as business owners get older, there's a desire to sort of reduce their risk exposure, and that question of, okay, do I still need to be guaranteeing the business can be a key factor for many. So another one that will nudge people in the direction of employee ownership is this kind of control and timings of succession and transfer. So there's some business owners who want to be gradual, right? They don't want to just hand over the keys and go off into the sunset, but they want to still be participating. They want to still be in the mix, and so we see many cases where an owner is on both the buy and the sell side of the transaction. So they sell the business to the co-op, and then they're a member of the co-op. And there's that sharing of the load and sharing of the risk of bringing more people in. Another is this kind of question of rewarding key management and employees around, okay, these folks helped build the business, and there's a lot of good relationship there, and that transitioning ownership to them just simply makes sense on almost an emotional level, as well as a legacy level where the business might continue on in a way where it's not being rolled up by a private equity firm or something like that. So a lot of different motivations, and again, this slide is not a total overview, but it's something to think about both as a business owner or as an employee who's thinking about potentially buying the business, to really be clear and be honest about what are the motivations, because that can in many cases inform the approach that's taken. So getting into what is a worker co-op. So worker co-op is a subset of cooperatives in general, which there's the very broadest definition, kind of derived from the International Cooperative Alliance, which is the sort of peak body of the co-op movement, is a business owned and democratically controlled by its members for their common good. So there's different kinds of cooperatives. The food co-op, right, where you go and buy groceries, is owned by the customers. It's a consumer cooperative. There's big agricultural co-ops like Land O'Lakes or Cabot, are owned by the farmers as producer and marketing co-ops. And then so a worker co-op is a business that is where membership is limited to those who work in the business. And so each member buys one share and is a direct owner of the business, which means that they have the governance rights to elect the board of directors. And they also share in profit. And the technical term actually that a lot of folks in co-ops use rather than profit is surplus, because one of the key nuances around what defines a cooperative is that it exists to operate on a not-for-profit basis towards its members. And how that practically functions, right? It's still a market institution. It aims to generate a profit or a surplus, but then it returns that profit or surplus to its members prorated by what's called their patronage, how much they contributed. So in the case of a consumer co-op, that's how much did you spend at the food co-op or REI each year. The co-op adds that up, and someone who spent $2,000 gets twice the share of surplus as someone who gets $1,000. So it's a way of allowing a business to generate a surplus that allows them to, deal with the risk that you inevitably, and the uncertainty of dealing with the market, but then having a mechanism to return that profit to the members prorated by their contribution. So for a worker co-op, the contribution is labor or work. And so that profit and that patronage refund is generally prorated on most co-ops in Vermont when we surveyed them, distributed on the basis of hours worked. You're also allowed to do it on the basis of W-2 income, and you can sort of are also allowed to weight to a certain extent by seniority. So there's some flexibility in that, but the core concept is this idea that you work, you generally get your market rate wages, and then if there's surplus at the end of the year, the members share in that. And some of that surplus can come in cash, and some can be retained by the co-op as working capital. So each member can have an internal capital account that's equity in addition to the share that they purchased. Management, there's a sort of general perception of co-ops as having kind of more flat management with consensus and all of that. And there's plenty of co-ops that do follow that model, but it's not inherent to the model. And there's also many that are quite successful that have more hierarchical or traditional management structures, because the key of them being democratic is ultimately that governance accountability, right? So the board of directors might supervise a general manager who then supervises hires and fires employees, and then those employee owners then elect the board. So there's a circular flow of power and accountability in the organization. And then, as I mentioned before, kind of when thinking about comparing this to our other sort of major form of employee ownership that we work with, right? It's the ESOP. It's much less expensive to set up and maintain. A key difference is that with an ESOP, each year the business has to go through a valuation. So you kind of have an independent evaluator come in, they determine the total value of the company, and then sort of like in relation to the market value of similar companies and that sort of thing, or multiples, and then you assign a value to the share. With a worker co-op, the share price is not based on the market value of the company, but rather sort of a balance between what feels like real skin in the game to everyone, but what's also affordable to folks on the low end of the wage scale. So it's more subjective than attempting to sort of be objective. And so in Vermont, when we did a survey, I think the lowest share price was $250, I believe, and the highest was about $15,000. And that was really based on, the 15,000 was a company where you're getting several $1,000s profit sharing a year. The 250 was a company where a lot of folks are relatively low wage and even part-time, so they wanted to make it accessible to folks. Right. So legal structure for this it can be done in a few different ways, and one of the key things to understand is that the way that co-ops are treated on a tax basis is under IRS code subchapter T. And so as long as a company kind of conforms to some key elements that the government has defined as operating on a cooperative basis, its actual sort of legal form can take a few different things. So there's ways of specially designing LLCs, as that's an incredibly flexible mechanism. You can easily do it with a C corporation, or many states have a special worker, including Vermont, have a special worker cooperative corporation statute that can be incorporated under. That's essentially a C corporation, but with, again, some special requirements to it. So I've already discussed share price. So those internal capital accounts I mentioned earlier, this is kind of an important thing to understand when it comes to how someone enters and how someone exits, and what the liability of the company is to paying folks out. So when you start, generally you work for this eligibility period. Maybe again, that can kind of go anywhere between we've seen like 1 and 5 years. In terms of the yes, I'll answer that question in just a sec, Steve. Thank you for that. So generally it's 1 to 5 years. It's oftentimes very industry dependent, but the consideration is really on how much time does it take to feel like you've really gotten a sense of someone, if they're a good fit in terms of culture and you understand how they work, and it makes sense for them to become a co-owner. And there's some industries or organizations where 6 months to a year is, that makes sense. We've got it. If you'd like to join and become a co-owner, welcome aboard. And there's others, and we tend to see a longer, for instance, in design build worker co-ops, a longer eligibility period, because oftentimes they want to see for folks work a few seasons or a few different types of job and that sort of thing. But so again, there's no one size fits all approach. It's really dependent on the company and the kind of work that you do. But so for the internal capital accounts piece, so generally someone will buy, once you've passed your eligibility period, someone will buy in, they'll pay in the price, and for co-ops with higher prices, oftentimes there'll be a kind of financing approach where you put down a down payment and you pay the rest out of, say, payroll deduction for a year or something like that. And then each year when the profits are distributed, the board will decide a portion will go out in cash, and usually it's at least enough to cover taxes, so kind of minimum 20% or so, because it's taxes as ordinary income. And the remainder that hasn't been paid out, the board might say, okay, we're going to retain that. That's retained in each member's name. And so anything that's retained kind of as that retained patronage isn't taxed at the corporate level. It's only taxed at the individual level, which is a modest but nice tax benefit. And then, so when someone leaves, what the co-op kind of does is usually it will buy back their share at face value, right? So if they put, let's say it's $1,000. They put $1,000 in. When they leave, the co-op will buy back that share for $1,000. and then the co-op will pay out whatever has been retained in their internal capital accounts. And some co-ops will simply, won't pay any sort of interest or anything on that. Others will. So Equal Exchange, which I'll show a little thing from in a moment, bigger worker co-op on the East Coast, primarily, although nationwide coverage, they actually pay a dividend each year, so that there's some reward for the retained and some cost for the retained capital. But so the board generally has flexibility to say, okay, if we're in rough situation right now, we can hold off on paying that out until we're in better financial position, so that the obligation to pay that capital doesn't undermine the viability of the co-op overall. So we had a question from Steve. So let me just look at that real quick. Oh, it might have been in the chat rather than the Q&A. I'll stop sharing just for a moment. So just to confirm, everyone pays the same amount for their one share, but then sharing profits is typically done on wages or hours worked. Correct, yes. All right, so we'll go back to the screen share here. So this is this little graphic is from Equal Exchange, which I just mentioned, that kind of shows their governance structure and flow, that circular flow I mentioned earlier. And I like this because it really sort of, I think, helps encapsulate how this works. So in their case, they have actually 2 executive directors rather than a single one. And so those executive directors are worker owners, and they hire, their role is to hire those workers who become worker owners. So their worker owners elect 6 members of their 9-member board of directors. And this is another consideration where all worker co-ops that I'm aware of will have at least a majority of members on their board, but many will consider the idea of having some outside directors as a source of voice and perspective from stakeholders and other things. So in this case, in the case of Equal Exchange, I believe they have a director who represents kind of food co-ops who they do a lot of their sales through. They have a director who represents the sort of farm co-ops that they source a lot of their products from. And then I think they have a director who represents or kind of comes from faith communities who they also sell a lot of their product through. So in that, in this case, it's, a pretty, that question of, who you want to bring in from the outside is, again, very, very sector dependent. But the, but that board then hires and sets goals for and supervises those executive directors. All right, so that's the basic kind of framework of the worker cooperative model. And so, what does it look like to exit to a worker co-op? So when thinking about, there's a lot of kind of variables, but one of the key things is certainly, this is something where the employees are going to have a form of direct ownership in the business. So they are they are going to be on the buy side. And this is another thing that differentiates it from the ESOP model, where employees are receiving ownership as a benefit, but not expected to usually put direct skin in the game at the point of transaction. So employees do need to be involved in the conversation. So oftentimes it's, after, if it's an owner who's considering this, after doing a little bit of research, kind of the next step is really to to look into the this question of, like, are the employees interested? Do a little bit of employee education, have a meeting with them. That's something that we at the EOC will often do, is to sort of come in and do a presentation, answer questions, and kind of work through, is this something that you want to kind of continue on? Then the next question is assessing the employee group's capability of taking on the buyer role. And that can, and that's something that's not a fixed thing, right? It can kind of go back and could easily go back and forth. But the key, or, it can involve an educational component, right? Where it's like, okay, like, do we need to sort of set up some meetings with the Small Business Development Center to kind of give a steering committee of employees some baseline education to sort of understand certain business concepts that are necessary to be able to be an informed participant in a transaction? Is there a clear management succession plan? So if the business owner has been the manager and is considering staying on as a member of the co-op, that's a very different situation than if they are, if they're essentially, hoping to ride off into the sunset. You really need to make sure that someone can fully fill their role. Is the business saleable or financeable? This is obviously a big one, right? Is it already sort of burdened down with debt? Does the seller have kind of an unrealistic sense of how much it's worth compared to the actual a third party valuation? Is there collateral? Because the financing will very much depend. The types of financing used will depend on is there collateral? Is this cash flow based lending? Is there equity? Is there a form of kind of patient equity? And then there's some cultural considerations, right? So it is definitely a transition culturally from the role of purely employee owner or of employee to employee owner. And so if there's a history of teamwork and information sharing and a culture of trust in the organization, you can kind of get to the point where this will be viable a lot faster than if that's something where you're considering it and saying, okay, we need to build that. Maybe we should start doing open book management for a year or two so that the employees really understand how the business works as a economic engine in addition to the practical operations. And that can really deal with timing. So kind of a perfect scenario might be an owner who's willing to fully seller finance and is going to stay on. You could see a deal like that happening in maybe 6 months or something. Whereas more common, you've got some educational work to do, you've got some sort of culture building to do to really sort of lay the groundwork. And ideally, it could be part of a succession plan that covers that where you're working on it for a year or two before you really decide to take the leap. So this is a document from the Democracy at Work Institute, Workers to Owners Collaborative. I'll go full screen there. That I think is just also nice, breaking it into 5 steps as a flow, and we're part of this collaborative. So there's the explore phase where it's just learning about it. Oftentimes we like to see the business owner do a very simple valuation. You can go to the SBDC and get them to do some sort of like a back of the envelope type rough thing to just get some range and reality check to whatever number they have in their head in terms of the valuation of the business. And then starting to engage with, doing some reading and engaging with both employees and business owner. You move on to the assess phase, and this is really where you start to assess feasibility. This is where you break out the spreadsheets and say, okay, is this realistic? If there is debt, how much debt needs, could it hold? How should that be structured so it's realistic? And also sort of being like, okay, so if there is training and other things, what are the needs for that? Like lining those pieces up. If that assessment, everything feels realistic and doable, and people are saying, okay, this feels like the best path for us. Move into the prepare phase, right? So you're designing the structures, making sure the bylaws are right. There's some model bylaws that group can essentially just go through a checklist and say, okay, well, what are decisions that are big enough we need to have a vote of the full membership, like buying real estate or moving, over a certain value, or moving the company or shutting the company down or getting an acquisition offer, right? How long does the probationary period or trial period need to be? There's a bunch of things that the group, the new owners need to sort of come to an agreement on that'll govern their future relationships. This is also when you go out and start talking to capital providers. If there's going to need to be external financing, what does that look like? What are the terms? It's kind of a bit of a shopping phase. Developing that management succession plan, both in terms of short term, but also thinking about longer term, that even if that owner is going to stay on, there still needs to be a plan for how do they gradually build those additional skills amongst other folks. And then, kind of forming the initial board of directors, oftentimes a steering committee that sort of, once it's incorporated, becomes the board of directors, and sort of getting everyone clear on how governance is going to work, because having this democratic structure is a key part of the life of a co-op, and everyone needs to sort of understand both what that means and what the limitations on that are, right? Where sort of having your governance hat on and voting for the board is not the same thing as being able to override your manager at any point, because the operations and the governance are two different hats that folks need to be clear about. So once you've kind of gotten all those ducks in a row, then you have to drop a little bit of money, pay the lawyers, do the purchase and sale agreement, really make the transaction happen. And then once all right, you're off to the races as a co-op. There's still work to be done, right? Because there's both that ongoing work of facilitating a strong ownership culture, so that both for existing folks, but also as new folks come in, how do you onboard them? How do you communicate? What does it mean now for you to be coming to a place where we expect folks to be co-owners? And then also engaging in support networks. One of the co-op principles is cooperation among cooperatives. So there's a lot of resources and kind of willingness for peer-to-peer support. So in Vermont, we have the Green Mountain Worker Co-op Alliance, which is a little informal network of co-ops. Nationally, there's the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops that has some shared services and a lot of training resources and other things like that. So, but so the company then not just being like, all right, we're at the finish line now, we can just go off and do our own thing, but starting to sort of integrate and both provide and receive value from these larger networks. So when thinking about financing, this can often be one of those big questions, and one of the points at which there's a few misconceptions that can scare people off before they really have looked too deeply. So one of the things that oftentimes people will kind of like have in their head as the equivalent to, or the closest equivalent, is a partnership. And so when they're thinking, okay, maybe there's 5 employees who all want to buy the business, does that mean we need to each come up with 20% of the sale price and then we own 20% of the business? That's a common way of thinking about ownership, but that's not kind of how a co-op works, right? So the reality is usually those voting shares constitute a small percentage of the sale price. I'd say maybe 2 to 5% is normal. In certain higher wage sectors, maybe we're talking more like 10 to 20, but not expecting those employee owners, especially if you've got folks who are fairly low wage and low wealth, to be able to come up with the whole amount. And this is oftentimes something where when people are like, oh, they think about it and then they think, oh, okay, $500,000 divided by 10 people, and thinking about who my employees are, nah, that's not going to work. But the reality is that there are friendly resources out there that can come to the table that would not come to the table for a sale to manager and that sort of thing. So we'll get into what some of those are in a moment. But this does mean that oftentimes significant outside financing, if seller financing is not the sole source, is needed. And oftentimes, with some exceptions, conventional lenders are unfamiliar with the details of the model, and this can lead to some challenges, particularly around personal guarantees. And this is, I think, one of the biggest points of confusion, and in terms of financing, is that for most small business lending, oftentimes it's 1 or 2 owners who have a line of credit or other things, and they have personal guarantees that mean that if business goes belly up, their house and their other assets are kind of on hawk if necessary. Once you get above a certain number of worker owners in a worker co-op, that becomes increasingly challenging, because you have folks who are equal owners but have very different asset bases. So there could be someone who owns significant assets, is like career, they have a house, they have cars, they have all the stuff, and then someone else this is their first job out of college, they really don't own much, and having an equal guarantee from each person is itself unequitable. And then there's also the question of, because worker co-ops are designed to allow for owners to kind of come in and out of ownership in a fairly smooth way, right? There's a clear onboarding and offboarding mechanism. Then, from a lender's perspective, does that mean every time a new person passes a probationary period, they have to be added to the thing, and once they leave, they have to be taken off? And what happens if they're taken off? There's a lot of kind of administrative challenges around that, even beyond the questions of fairness. And so that can leave some uncollateralized gaps, especially sort of from cash flow lenders who are looking at, who sort of see those guarantees as the alternative to collateral. So the 2 common ways that worker co-ops are financed are debt and non-voting preferred stock, which which behaves very similarly to kind of a patient interest-only note, but that is equity on the balance sheet. So as I mentioned, those member shares are the first source, but are often a small one. Generally, when there is outside financing, the lenders are going to want to see some level of seller paper, right? It could be simply a loan that's paid in parallel to or after the financial institution. It could be an earnout, and this is something that we're definitely exploring right now, because in this COVID moment, this question of how do you value a business when so much business valuation is like, oh, let's look at the past 3 years and we'll take a standard industry multiple and normalize certain things and yada yada yada, and then boom, we have this number that we think is a defensible value of the company. Well, when it's really hard to project into the future, is the future going to look like the past? Probably less so now than it has for a long time. How do you come up with a value for the business? And so the idea of an earnout is really that the owner can kind of share in both downside and upside risk for a period of time. So you could design a note that says, all right, so if we, if the company behaves and performs in the next few years as if it was worth $500,000, you'll receive this level of compensation. If it performs better than that, you'll receive a portion of that upside. But if it performs worse than that, you'll be paid less, and it'll reflect kind of the a lower valuation, which might be more realistic. So you can be creative about ways to sort of share that kind of risk and reward piece. Then there's sources of institutional debt and equity. So traditional financial institutions, again, this can be sometimes something they're unfamiliar with, but there are educational tools, and certainly one thing that we at VEOC have tried to do is make sure that we've done some lunch and learns with banks and other things to try to make sure that they're a little more familiar about what this looks like. So if a business already has a relationship with a financial institution and that institution would like to keep the relationship, there can be an incentive for them to be a little more flexible. Probably the biggest resource in our region is the Cooperative Fund of New England, which is a CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution. They were founded by co-ops 40 years ago, funded by social investors. They're a nonprofit, and they really, their specialty is lending to cooperatives. So many of the deals that we've worked on have had them as at least a portion of the financing. And they, as a specialized lender, understand the personal guarantee challenges. They're willing to be more flexible with collateral. They do still like to see collateral. So oftentimes they're a piece, but not the whole thing. Our organization has a revolving loan fund that can loan up to $50,000 per deal. Oftentimes as participations with CFNE is what we've done in the past. And the Vermont Economic Development Authority has some instructions from the state legislature to actually prioritize lending to employee-owned businesses. We've only seen that kind of like go into action in one deal where they were a small participant, but that's something that we definitely would like to see more of and exploring. And then there's those preferred shares, which essentially can look like you buy in, say it's $100 face value. The first slice of profit up to a 5% or 6% return on those preferred shares goes to the preferred shareholders, and then the rest can then be distributed to the members of the co-op. And then oftentimes it's something where the co-op's board has the discretion to buy those shares back at its leisure. So an example, sort of one of the best examples of a co-op sort of using that consistently has been, as I mentioned, Equal Exchange, where they've raised I think over $15 million over the years with these preferred shares that have a target return of 5%. And years that they're doing really well, maybe they'll pay a little bit more. If they're really struggling, they'll pay a little bit less. But over the past 20 years, pretty consistent 5% returns. And so here in Vermont, Vermont's one of a handful of states that allows state chartered credit unions to make equity investments in other co-ops. So VSECU has a fund that specifically exists to make those sorts of investments, and they've expressed interest in worker co-op conversions. So they've made a few investments in worker co-ops up to this point, but that's, I believe their cap is like $150,000. And that can be sort of a pretty powerful tool to say, okay, well, here's a bit of extra equity that sits under the debt that is part of a deal. And then there's this question of kind of community raise. And one of the questions that was submitted before this project, I think, before the seminar relates to this, which was this idea of exit to community that's come out of the platform co-op world. Nathan Schneider and others have talked about this as, especially for tech companies, the alternative of, selling to users or other things like that. versus kind of the exit to an IPO or private equity or roll up by a bigger company. And so practically in Vermont, what this can look like is on a small scale, kind of member, friends, and family loans or equity. So a number of our co-ops have done this, whether it was offering sort of preferred shares for a co-op that started up, or for a conversion, there's a sort of, after running the numbers, we kind of hit the point where the debt service coverage ratio just wasn't quite where it needed to be for the lender to be comfortable. So it was maybe about a $25,000 gap. And so because they had a lot of low-income employees, they really didn't feel comfortable raising the share price. So they went to a subset of those employees and said, hey, would you be willing to make an additional loan to the co-op, that would be paid out over 5 years that would nudge our number over that line? And they were able to raise the $25,000 they needed to do that, just kind of by circulating it informally. Kind of in a more formal way where you start to be covered outside of some of the securities exemptions that allow for those informal small scale raises, is going to things like milk money or other equity crowdfunding platforms that allow you to reach out to a much broader group of folks. And a really great success story on that front was, in terms of this kind of direct public offering approach, is Real Pickles, which is a worker co-op based in Western Massachusetts, Greenfield, Mass. So they had a big base of very loyal customers. Those customers, loved their product. They sold in a lot of food co-ops. So when they made the decision to convert to a worker co-op, part of their financing, both for the conversion and also for some working capital to grow, was to go to those customers and say, hey, we're doing a direct public offering. If you want to buy these preferred shares that pay a 4% dividend, you'll help us do that. And a lot of folks who are interested in community and social investment took them up on it, and they raised, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of $800,000. So especially for companies that have that sort of strong invested community base, that those customers, even if you're a worker co-op and not a consumer co-op, can still be potentially sort of tapped as a source of both immediate financing, but also as a way of building a stronger relationship with them going forward, because now they have vested interest in the company's success. So there's some really interesting possibilities there that I think folks are still exploring in creative ways. So the final thing I'll just throw out is, for folks who are interested in really sort of digging deeper into these topics, there's 2 great resource libraries on ESOPs, but also on kind of more, kind of roll your own approaches to equity compensation as well. The NCEO, National Center for Employee Ownership, has a great resource library with a lot of sort of documents on it. And then they also have some deeper dive books you can order that you can really sort of go down the rabbit hole on some of these topics. And then for worker co-ops, similarly, the Democracy at Work Institute, which is sort of a nonprofit spinoff of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, maintains a fabulous resource library and has a number of great documents that both kind of go through the conversion process, financing things, and then culture building, good governance practices, all these sorts of things that if you are a worker co-op and you really need to consider, then then they're a great place to go. And then there's a number of events and things as well that bring these communities together. The NCEO just had their conference for the first time online this year. The worker co-ops tend to have there's a U.S. Federation national conference every year, and then an Eastern Western on other opposite years. And then the VEOC, we do an annual conference. It's usually in June. Because of COVID, we've pushed it back to August 18th. So we'll be putting out some information on registration and details on that front fairly soon. And then I'd say finally, we are always happy to have one-on-one conversations with folks who are interested in exploring and kind of doing the initial sniff test to say, hey, is this feasible? Is this worth putting some effort into to explore? So definitely, feel free to reach out to me, matt@veoc.org. If you're interested in just kind of like getting some advice, it's free conversations, and we have dozens of them a year, and some of them it makes sense, and others will be honest and say this probably another approach will be better for you. But it's a good way to sort of start your journey as you think about either wanting to sell the business, or if you want to say, hey, this is something where I'd be interested in making an offer to the person who owns it. We've seen certainly seen co-ops that have come into being both ways, right? And there's you know, one I can think of in particular where it was something where the owner was a serial entrepreneur who's kind of getting more interested in his next business, and the employees of a business was an existing business were like, you know, I think we're more in a place to put our attention and energy into this, and if we owned it, like, we would do that. So let's offer to buy it, and they did. And so there's a lot of different ways that co-ops, these worker co-ops, can come into being. You know, the buying an existing business is a very common one. You know, there's also opportunities for entrepreneurship with them, and you know, and sort of, you know, the revival or, you know, group of folks who have worked together in the past starting something similar. So a lot to explore on that front. But so that concludes my slides. So I'll stop sharing now, and I'll check and see if you know, if anyone has posed any questions through the Q&A. Let's see if I can stop the share here. So feel free to put things in through chat or otherwise, but I have a few questions that folks have submitted in advance as well. So one of the questions, let me just pull that up. Yeah, so one of the questions was around, you know, around geography, right? So of course we work with, you know, we're Vermont based. We work with a lot of companies that are primarily here. But so this question of, you know, does it make sense to, are there certain places that it would make sense to more or to both incorporate and operate, or if you have folks who are distributed? And there's a lot of distributed worker co-ops out there, particularly I'd say, you know, there's some examples in kind of web design and others where you have, you know, where we have one or two people in Vermont and someone in, you know, Philadelphia and someone in Virginia and someone in Minnesota. And so, you know, it's a fairly, you know, it's a model where the tax treatment is at the federal level. So it doesn't really make too much of a difference where you're working. Of course, there's always the administrative challenges of having, you know, dealing with multiple people on different, you know, different income tax or state tax regimes and all of that. But that's, you know, a thing that is true regardless of, you know, whether you're an employee-owned business or some other kind of business that is that's operating in multiple locations. The other thing is just kind of in terms of incorporation itself. There's, you know, some different states have a few different kind of tailored models that allow for additional things like multiple stakeholder groups and things like that. There has been recently a lot of energy around Colorado in particular, which has a structure called there's a number of states that have them called limited cooperative association. That there's a lawyer out there, Jason Weiner, who's been doing some interesting work around how to use that to create things that, you know, have both a worker stakeholder group that owns part of it and a consumer stakeholder group that owns part of it. And so if you're curious about those sorts of things, and particularly that's been used in some of this kind of platform co-op discourse and activity around creating sort of web platforms that are really based on shared ownership. So he's been working with a fair number of those. I think one interesting example that has those multiple classes that would be worth looking at if you're interested is called Savvy, which is a co-op of kind of patients who participate in various kinds of studies. And so it's, you know, primarily owned by the patients, but it also has a founder class and a worker class of ownership in it as well. All right, looks like there's another thing. Oh yeah, thanks for the webinar. I'm wondering if there's a list of existing worker co-ops in Vermont. Yes, so if you go on our website, and I'll post it to the chat. But we do have we maintain a list of all the employee-owned companies in Vermont, both co-ops and ESOPs, and I believe that they're that we have it so they're listed which is which. But I can kind of, you know, they cover a variety of sectors. We have, you know, everything from Catamount Solar, which is a, you know, solar installation co-op that came into being. Actually, their path was there were three co-founders who all were kind of had independent sole proprietorship businesses where they installed solar panels and then would often call on each other for help if they had a job where, you know, they needed an extra set of hands or something like that, and then decided it made sense for them to all come together into a single under a single umbrella, and they've grown quite nicely. You have something like PT360, which is a physical therapy worker co-op that was founded by a dozen members initially who all had worked together under the same or at different practices in the area, and decided they wanted to start a worker co-op where they were all working together and equal owners. And they've grown, I think, of 3 locations now. There's the New School of Montpelier, which is a private school that provides services to small kind of rural public school districts for students who have like very high needs. So oftentimes like 2-on-1 support. And they converted maybe 5 years ago. 4 or 5 years ago, and have about 50 employees. And then you have some smaller ones like Tamarack Media, which does web design. You have, I think one of the oldest ones is Green Mountain Spinnery, which was I think originally, incorporated as a co-op and maybe as the 80s. So I think at last count we had somewhere in the neighborhood of a dozen or 15, I believe, active worker co-ops in the state. All right. So if anyone has any other questions, I think the one other resource that I would throw out that we always find very helpful, and I'll put a link to that as well in the chat, is a document from the Democracy at Work Institute and Cooperative Fund of New England. The title is "The Lending Opportunity of a Generation," and it's so it was originally targeted towards lenders who are interested in educating themselves about lending to worker co-ops. But in my opinion, it covers a great, it provides a great summary of the worker co-op model. It has some case studies in it, and it kind of helps you think through a little bit of the kind of like how the financing can really work effectively when you're sort of bringing together those different possible sources. So I'll just throw the link right here in the chat. All right, so I will stop the recording now, and